Hi there. My name is Stephen Lashley, Director of Communications for the D-Day Squadron. The D-Day Squadron is part of the Tunison Foundation, and I do have to take a moment to really thank the support of our partners, including Aeroshell, Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, Flight Safety International, AOPA, Consolidated Aircraft Coating, Dassault Falcon Jet, Rocket Route, Bose Aviation, MetLife, Lift Aviation, Signature Flight Support, Fly Trade Wind, Warbird Digest, and the Winslow Division of Collins Aerospace. Now, I would like to welcome you to a discussion that's coming really at a rather unique point in history. We're going to offer two perspectives today. One is from Dave Hamilton, someone that was there in 1944 at the absolute tip of the spear of the invasion in Normandy. But also, we're going to learn about some of the challenges today in 2019, because the mission of the D-Day Squadron is we're going to bring over 70-year-old aircraft across the North Atlantic in time for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So in light of that, joining us are Eric Zipkin, Andy Mag, and Joe Ensminger. These are some of the pilots that are launching this effort to bring together the largest formation of C-47s over Normandy that's been seen since the end of the war, in order to hopefully pay fitting tribute to veterans like Dave. So, gentlemen, I'm going to ask these questions, and all three of you can really jump in on the beginning of this as you see fit, or we can take it one at a time. I'd like to start off with what you really feel are the top three toughest challenges in flying aircraft of this age over so much open water in terms of when we're making the initial Atlantic crossing. And I should take a step to give our viewers a little bit of a background here. Basically, these aircraft will be departing from Oxford, Connecticut. We'll be stopping in Goose Bay, Canada. We're going to have stops in Greenland, in Iceland, in Prestwick, Scotland. Ultimately, we'll end up in Duxford, UK for events from June 2nd to 5th. Then we're actually we're joining another group called DAX over Normandy to bring together almost 40 aircraft that are going to be crossing the channel on June 5th. And then from the 5th to the 9th, we're actually going to be in the Normandy area for the commemoration events. So with that, guys, why don't you just talk about what in your mind is some of the largest challenges that you see, first of all, in flying over open water, and then we'll get into some other specifics.
Well, for today, the navigation side is a lot simpler now than in the days of Mr. Hamilton here. So we have dual GPSs on our plane. You know, we pretty much get to follow a magenta line. So that part will be fairly simple. We actually have all of the celestial navigation equipment in That's All Brother. However, none of us know actually how to use it. So navigation's well covered. I'd say some of the tough things, I'll let Joe and Eric chime in as well. Some of the tougher things will be the weather. That'll obviously be the big unknown. It's a logistical challenge to get through Greenland for us. We'll have, somewhere around 10 planes looking to fly through Greenland. Some of us will skip it. That's All Brother and Placid Lassie, Eric's plane, will be a couple that will be stopping in Greenland. And they can fuel about one airplane per hour. And so you can imagine the logistical challenge of not bunching up on the ramp while we're there.
Okay.
Eric here.
Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll echo Andy's thoughts about the weather is probably our biggest challenge. The C-47 DC-3 airplanes are not swift, so we are down at low altitude and in the weather for a significant period of time. So finding our weather window to be able to fly safely across is probably the biggest challenge. And again, as Andy pointed out, fuel and oil availability, because it is a type of fuel that's not readily available throughout the world anymore, is a second challenge. Okay,
Eric, at a high level, can you give us just an idea of the scope of this effort, of the whole mission, just so we can get an idea of? I'm basically just trying to give the cliff notes of this kind of effort and the massive scale of it.
Sure. So we're looking at approximately 18 aircraft coming from North America to make the crossing over to the UK for the commemoration, and then we've got approximately 20 aircraft coming from various parts of Europe to join us there. So you're talking about each one of those airplanes burns about 100 gallons of avgas per hour. Each aircraft has a crew between 5 and 10 people. and each aircraft is also consuming at least a gallon of oil per hour. So we're talking about literally thousands upon thousands of gallons of fuel, really thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and kind of an enormous logistical project, just moving people through these areas and housing them and feeding them.
Okay, and Andy, and then I'll let Eric and you and Joe can jump on this as well. How do you prepare for such a mission personally? How do you get yourself basically into that place where you can take on such an effort?
Right. Well, it's been a very long go, and I have to give kudos to Eric and the rest of the D-Day squadron for really starting early on this, and bringing his expertise, because he's done this journey before. His plane traveled to Normandy for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, whereas That's All Brother's only been flying for the last year. I think this last year for us has been one of a lot of preparation. Getting the plane back into working order. When it first flew a little over a year ago, it didn't have the correct paint job. None of the interior was fitted out. And for the history of this plane, we wanted to give it the full treatment to honor all the veterans, such as Mr. Hamilton here, who bravely flew and jumped out of that plane so many years ago. So a lot of restoration work has gone on. Specifically for the crossing, we've acquired, obviously, the necessary survival gear and done survival training. So some of the preparations we've done, our crews went up to Oklahoma City to take part in the water survival and basic survival courses taught by the FAA. It's good you actually get in the water, you get from the water into the life raft and all that stuff. The only thing they don't simulate, that water is about 85 degrees. You could take a bath in it. And that, if push came to shove, and we all certainly hope it will not, and the C-47 will fly just really great on one engine. And so we don't intend to go into the water, but if it does, if we do, it would be extremely cold compared to that pool water.
Yeah. Eric, how about you? Anything also just personally in terms of getting yourself mentally ready for such a mission?
Well, our world is probably a lot busier than it was several decades ago, and actually my biggest personal challenge has been one of finding the time to be able to devote. We're looking at being on the road for somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, which personally is always challenging to be able to clear the decks, and then also be able to kind of be in a position to block out other distractions. And we have a mission to accomplish. It's a very serious mission, both from a historical standpoint and from a pure practical standpoint. So being able to focus 110% on that is probably the most challenging thing personally. And that allows me the moments to look out on the wing of our aircraft and see that not only did an aircraft like this, but this actual aircraft and these actual rivets flew across the Atlantic and flew over Normandy 75 years ago.
That's a great segue. Joe, let me jump to you. Is it to fly an aircraft with this much history behind it, and also basically the technical challenges of flying a C-47 compared to more modern aircraft that many pilots may be used to?
Well, I'll start with the technical challenge part of it. Certainly, it's for me personally, it's the largest airplane I've flown, and there are a lot of little intricacies to flying a 75-year-old airplane that you don't get, jumping into a modern training aircraft or a modern multi-engine airplane. I mean, just taxiing the C-47 is, it requires 2 feet your hands, and you're managing a tail wheel lock, and you're managing winds and braking and all that stuff. It's a lot different than just jumping in a tricycle gear airplane and taxiing out the runway and taking off. So there's quite a bit to that. And from a training perspective, we've spent a lot of time. Our airplane, we've had it now a little over a year, and we've had to get our entire crews up to speed on it. So we started with some experienced C-47 pilots, but a lot of our guys, some of them may have a lot of C-47 time, but it was 20 or 30 or even 40 years ago. So it's been a pretty big challenge to get our crews up to speed and flying and getting them the time in the airplane that we think they need to be able to safely do this trip.
Okay. And let me ask you, do you guys, when you're training for this kind of trip, are you using some of the original documentation? Like, are you using a flight training syllabus from the Second World War, or how you're preparing to fly this aircraft today different than the way they would have trained on it in, say, 1943?
Well, we certainly are using the same flight manuals. There's, a lot of learning has happened in the 75 years of the DC-3 since 1944. So, we have the access to the same resources. We have access to the same documentation. We certainly use all that to train, but we also have access to a wealth of knowledge and experience in the DC-3 and C-47 that probably wasn't available to the guys that were flying in 1944. I mean, our airplane, for instance, was built in March and flew over the Atlantic shortly thereafter. They're just, the crews in 1944 did not get the benefit of the experience that we're getting flying these airplanes. I mean, we have 75 years of learning that we can rely upon. Those guys did not. They were, I don't know Mr. Hamilton in particular, but I'm sure his experience was like many. They came out of pilot training and they were thrust into operations very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of time to learn on the job. You were just doing it. We have the benefit of being able to ease into it and to learn it the sort of a more modern way, and also not have to, as we say in our organization, we don't have to fly. We're not fighting a war, and so the things we do, we are able to do with a little with a lower risk profile than they might have been doing in 1944.
Right. And Eric, oh, I'm sorry, Joe, you have something else you were gonna?
Go ahead, Eric. I think Eric was.
No, I was just about to add one element that we are using a lot of the original information about is our formation operations. We're really doing a lot of work. We've done a lot of research to try to replicate the way that the aircraft flew in formation as best possible, both from a historical accuracy standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint, because they did. It's probably the one of the last times that many of these airplanes flew in formation in a tactical way, and they knew how to do it in World War II, and we're learning from those lessons. So we're trying to replicate the formations as best we can.
And Andy, speaking of the formation flying, what about not just beyond the C-47, but just flying such a large transport aircraft in general? What are some of the things that you're trying to keep in mind as you're flying in those close quarters?
So I think the old Navy saying is that big boats turn slowly, and you certainly have that effect in the C-47 when you're flying formation, versus flying in a lighter plane like a T-6 or something like that, or in a plane in which you would learn to fly formation. So the C-47, you have to plan very far ahead. So if you are out of position and adding power to close things, you need to back off power very early before you're in position, and you're always having to think 2 steps ahead of the plane, just because you have a lot of mass and you don't like to make sudden throttle changes. You want to avoid those as much as possible to be as kind to the engines as you can be. So, but as far as that, the wonderful thing about the C-47, it's a very stable plane. One of the things it does very well is go straight and level, and a lot of the formation work we do, certainly the large transport formation work, is a lot of cross-country straight line flying. You don't do a lot of intensive maneuvering like you would do in some of the lighter trainers or fighters.
Okay. And I would like to take one moment for each of you guys, and we'll go, I guess, Eric, you can start, and we'll do Andy and Joe. What are you hoping at the end of the day? We're doing this to honor the service of people like Dave. What personally does this whole mission mean to you, and what are you hoping that people that witness it, what do you hope they're going to take away from it?
That's quite a question. That's quite a question. My personal connections. My father was a World War II veteran, and I grew up with the stories and the history of the war. And I'm probably one of the youngest people who has a direct relative that was in the war. And what I hope ultimately is that we tell those stories, and we bring the history forward to subsequent generations, and that people really understand the sacrifices that individuals made and that we made as a country during that time. And if we can bring that to even a small number of people and have them bring that forward to the next generation, then I will count this as a success.
Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have to echo Eric's sentiments there. The mission of the CAF is to educate, inspire, and honor through living history. So we want to educate future generations about all the sacrifices that went into fighting World War II. We want to inspire the next generation to be able to come together like the United States and our allies were able to do to, to defeat tyranny. And then finally is to honor the men and women who built these planes and the wonderful brave people like Mr. Hamilton here who flew them, and the men who jumped out of them as well into occupied France to change the course of history. And for the work that they did, we're here today doing what we do, and we enjoy the freedoms we have thanks to the efforts of those who came before us.
Joe, I'll let you close out the pilot portion with your thoughts on that topic.
Well, following up that is difficult, but I like to think of it, in sort of personal terms. This is likely, a lot of people say this is likely to be the last major anniversary of D-Day, where we have living D-Day veterans to experience it with us, and to be with us to honor them. And so, those opportunities are becoming rarer and rarer. And we've had the opportunity through this experience to meet men like Pee Wee Martin and Dick Cole and Dave Hamilton, and actually thank them for their service. And I think what's important to me as part of this trip is that we take as many of those opportunities as we can to say thank you, and to make sure that they know that what they did was important to us and important to our children, and that we're going to carry that forward and make sure that our kids and future generations remember, the significance of what happened in June 6, 1944, and the sacrifice and courage that it took to make those things happen. I mean, when I stood on the airplane, that's all brother, for the first time, when it was in Basler, it really hit me for the first time that, young men actually stepped out the door of that airplane into the night. And, I don't think I could have done that. And I think it's important to remember how important that action was to what we do today. I think Andy said it very well once, what we get to do is a luxury, and what they did was a necessity. And I think it's important that we remember that.
Okay, thank you. And gentlemen, thank you all for your thoughts on that. Now I'd like to go ahead and turn to the star of the hour, Dave Hamilton. He is one of the original, what's known as a Pathfinder pilot that was responsible for putting some of the very first boots on the ground during the invasion of Normandy. Dave, I think I speak for everyone in this audience when we thank you for the service that you did not only during the war, but for many years after. I think I'm going to start out, since we were talking about the challenges of the crossing, which is the northern route, but you actually flew the southern route. Why don't you share with us some of your experiences in the initial ferrying of the C-47 aircraft across the southern route?
Well, we were lucky to pick up our new airplanes at Bear Field, and we flew to West Palm Beach. And then on Christmas Eve, we flew to Puerto Rico and spent the night in Puerto Rico, then down to British Guiana in those days, and then to Belém at the mouth of the Amazon River. And of course, we used Tokyo tanks, which were internal in the cabin, and you had to learn how to work those because otherwise you'd run out of gas. But we got to Belém comfortably, spent a night, and then we spent another night because there was weather in Natal, Brazil. And then from Natal, Brazil, we flew to that little tiny island off the African coast called Ascension Island. And from Ascension, we flew up to Accra in what is now Ghana. Then from there to Freetown in Liberia. And then from there to Dakar. And then we were supposed to go to Marrakesh. Everybody in my outfit flying single ships. We didn't fly formation overseas on our way. And I had a single engine going through the pass into Marrakesh, went into Agadir on the coast, and eventually had to have an engine change. That was quite an adventure. And then I eventually went up to Casablanca to get the plane credited off. And then to Bottisford in England, up Meridian number 4, and went up to Bottisford. And I was in Bottisford for about a month and a week when the colonel called me in and said, "You've been recommended by your squadron commander to go to Pathfinders." Well, I knew a little bit about Pathfinders reading about the Royal Air Force, because they were the ones that developed pathfinding for their night bombing. And they had a lot of radar that we didn't have. But we eventually had it all in our C-47s. And it was amazing to have a $100,000 airplane with $400,000 or $500,000 worth of radar in it. And the only guns we had were the 45 I carried under my arm and the submachine gun, the Thompson, that my crew chief was issued. And on the ground, our planes were guarded by dogs. And if we were at a foreign base or a base other than our home base, we had our crew chief or a member of the crew stand by the door with the gun. It was interesting. One of the requirements, I didn't want to correct Andy, but one of the requirements in the Pathfinders was aircraft commanders had to drop in practice with the stick that they were going to drop in combat, the stick being the 18 paratroopers they carried. This was quite an adventure, and General Gavin of the 82nd Airborne was so pleased with it that he gave all of us the parachute bug, and he pinned it on in the fashion that was traditional, with a lot of force, and in some cases it brought a little blood to the surface, but very far away from the heart. Anyhow, I very wear my wings and my parachute bug with great pride, and also my parachute, Pathfinder parachute insignia on my left sleeve, which is indicative of a Pathfinder aircraft commander and co-pilot, navigator, and crew members, all Pathfinders. And we were 20 crews going into Normandy. 10 of us went down to south of France for Operation Dragoon. And then we came up and we were sent individually to the different troop carrier groups for the invasion of Holland, or Montgomery's mistake, as it was known in the American services. The last time I flew combat was taking 27 Pathfinder aircraft, because we were enlarged, our table of organization being provisional. We eventually had 4 squadrons, and we inducted a lot of new people, did a lot of training, and we went into Bastogne to relieve Bastogne, and we led the flight into Bastogne. I took 27 airplanes in and took 9 back to England. We eventually got more back in the next couple of days, but a couple of us got shot down. And I wasn't one of them, but the paratroopers came out and saved those crews. We had to blow up the airplanes, and those guys had some stories to tell when they got back.
Well, let's because I definitely wanted to jump into Bastogne a little more detail, but let's start with the big event, the one that we're commemorating. Let's go back about 28th of May. I understood at that point you started to get some indication that something was happening. The base was sealed. You know, you weren't allowed any phone calls. What were the first indications that you knew something was happening?
Yeah, that was a very good indication. I was fortunate in having a mother running a Red Cross club in London, and I'd been down to see her, and she'd been up to the Pathfinders and had been of great help to Colonel Crouch in getting our enlisted men out on the tarmac, coffee and donuts, because we had no hangar. The hangar was on the other side of the base. But when we couldn't get off the base, we were sealed, turned up our ID cards and everything. I just knew I couldn't call my mother and say anything, so that was it. And on the 1st of June, we went into sand table briefings with the stick that we were going to drop, and we got to know those boys pretty well. And we just and very quietly we just briefed with them. This is a picture of the final briefing of our Normandy And that's me there in the middle. My flight leader, Pete Miner, closest to the camera. And this is a picture that was taken before our takeoff of our crew. And we did have a intelligence observer, Captain McElroy from the 9th Air Force troop carrier, and he flew along as a passenger on my Normandy run, which I think probably scared the hell out of it, because we got quite a lot of 25 caliber bullets in our airplane. We just dropped our troops, according to my navigator, right on the button, midnight. And we had a cloud cover, which broke up our formation a little bit. And I hit the deck after they got all the static lines in. And my co-pilot says, "You better lift your right wing. We're going to hit the steeple at Sam Mary Gleaves Church," which I didn't think I wanted to go to church that badly. So we then headed for the island of Marcouf. And I remember being told in the briefings that the island of Marcouf was heavily armed. So I said, well, we just better go over it at the fastest speed we can. I think I was doing about 240 miles an hour, which in a C-47 makes it shudder. But that's all right. We got out there, and then finally my navigator said, "Come back here a second, Skipper." And I went and took a look at his scope on his SDR 717, and it looked like it had the measles. The sea down below was just absolutely filled with ships. You got the picture. You could almost walk from England to France and never hit the water. But I got the co-pilot to take a look too, and all the rest of the crew. We got back to England, and because we had been hit by anti-aircraft, we lost a wingtip, and we also lost part of the magnetos. They were shot away up there at the dividing point of the two cockpits, and two windshields at the cockpits. So when we landed, the only way we could turn the engines off was to cut the gas, and they were all off. The crew, and I was sitting up in the cockpit waiting for the engines to starve, filling out the Form 1s and writing a letter about some of our damage, because I put the airplane on a Red Cross, which meant it wasn't able to flyable. And 4 days later, the airplane flew again. They did a wonderful job. It did look patched up. It had the measles, but
Yeah. So let me ask you. So you were talking about almost clipping the Church of St. Mary Glaze. When you crossed the channel, you were actually flying at about 50 feet, weren't you, to avoid radar? What was your actual altitude when you were at different points in the mission?
Well, we left our base and we were flying at about 12 to 1,500 feet going out. We hit the water at Portland Bill, crossing the channel at 50 feet above the water to stay under the radar. And we pulled up when we made our turn going into the peninsula. And we pulled up to about 1,200 feet to 1,000 feet, hit the cloud bank, which was completely unannounced. And we were flying 3-ship formations to each drop zone. And the boys who went in the 101st were a little bit ahead of us. They couldn't report that the cloud bank was there. It's too bad they didn't, because it messed up a lot of things. I got separated from my lead plane and the left wing plane, and we dropped 45 seconds separate and didn't know it, but all of our troopers from our flight landed in drop zone T for tear. And that's when we hit the deck and went out over the church at Sam Mary and Marcouf Island. But going home,
the commander broke his both ankles when he landed. I understand it. How did the rest of the troopers do? Do you know any? How they fared?
Sam Quisenberry broke both ankles in a practice jump with his troopers, but he flew the mission. And he said, "You think I trained like this?" He was a sergeant pilot at Pearl Harbor. And he said, "You think I'm going to miss this mission because of a couple of broken ankles? You're crazy." So he didn't even tell the colonel. But they were able to get him aboard the plane. He flew the plane and got a Distinguished Flying Cross because he came back on a single engine. Yeah, he did quite a job. 4-fan Sam, we called him. Yeah. So my troopers, I heard later that between 4 and 8 of my troopers were hit before they hit the ground. And the stick commander, Captain McGill, First Lieutenant McGill, pardon me. He broke both his ankles in the drop. So command of the stick turned over to Charlie Ames, who he was a West Point, brand new second lieutenant West Point graduate. And this was his first operation, and he did very well. He ended up as a colonel and took over the control of the Coronado National Forest with headquarters in Tucson.
Wow.
Yep.
So what kind of fire were you taking? I think I heard 25 caliber in there, but I also believe you were so low that they couldn't hit you with 88s or anything like that. What exactly was making all those holes?
Well, the 25 caliber Schmeiser machine pistol, most of it, we got a wingtip shot off with a 20 millimeter, and that shot in the magnetos was a 20 millimeter, which sprayed a lot of glass and stuff on my co-pilot. But he had a helmet on, and goggles, and the whole thing, so he just brushed it off, and he couldn't put in for a Purple Heart. And we felt very lucky that that's all we got, because there were some planes that got more damage. We only lost one out of the 20 planes, and it was shot down before it dropped its troopers. It ditched in the water, and the crew were picked up by a British or Canadian Corvette. All they got was their feet wet, and they had to sink the plane because it was a hazard to navigation. They sank it by gunfire, and those poor troopers were somewhat humiliated. They had to be delivered to the Normandy front by an LST across Omaha Beach. So they lived it down, but they were teased for quite a while, believe me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand that your 3-ship flight actually hit 100% accuracy in the drop zone. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, we did. And we weren't the only ones. The parachute drop that preceded the rest of us, which were all Pathfinder drops, were tremendously accurate. Well, with all the radar we had, it had to be so. But the boys that came in after us, led by That's All Brother and their group, they had some trouble because of the inexperience with Rebecca Eureka and also with the Cloud Bank. And the Germans had flooded the Murderette River, and that wasn't picked up by the air reconnaissance photographs prior to D-Day. And a lot of our troopers, it came in the main serials, dropped into the water. But they made a tremendous showing, and small groups, I'm afraid the Germans felt that there were many more paratroopers dropped than actually were.
And what was your typical crew besides the troopers that you had at the time? What was your full aircraft crew loadout?
My whole aircraft crew was just pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and crew chief. And then I had a passenger, my intelligence officer, Captain McElroy, as a passenger.
And how did your navigator? I got a note here that your navigator had a special way of timing the drop. How did he do that?
Well, he was very smart. He anticipated the difference between him telling me to hit the little switch that turned on the green light, and he anticipated the whole thing by about 2.5 seconds. He told me, hit the button. I hit the button. By the time it got back to the back, and the jump master, McGill, who led the group out, saw it and everything. So the drop actually was absolutely on time and on perfect. And as I say, we were 45 seconds, as we found out later, different than the lead plane and the left wing. And they all landed evenly within relatively, the drop zone was relatively extensive. T for tear, if you can see on the map behind me, which I'm not sure you can, my big head's in the way. But the map was about, showed a drop zone of approximately 700 yards in length and possibly 200 yards in width, which was rather rare in Normandy because those hedges and how they separated their fields with these massive hedges that have been built up over hundreds of years.
So once you got in and you had to fill out those forms and obviously wait for your engines to finally run out of gas, How did you finish? I understood a cocktail was in order by the time the main wave was taken off.
Well, what happened? You went to debriefing, where you had to go through the whole tale of the mission, what you did. And at the briefing or debriefing, there was a bottle of IW Harper and a bottle of something else. And the bottle of IW Harper was greatly diminished by the time our debriefing was over. So we went and had breakfast, which was eggs again with shells on them, which we had had before we took off. This was rare. And then we hit the sack. And we were in the sack quietly and got up, of course, to all the news on the Stars and Stripes and on the British radio about what was going on. It was a very exciting time. I'm very honored to have been there and to have lived through it. And I was absolutely later amazed at the immensity of what it existed and the number of people, the boats, the people, and the equipment and the timing it took to plan it all. It was an unbelievable operation, and I don't think has been equaled since.
Mm. So we actually are getting some questions in from our audience. Someone wanted to know what you felt the first time you actually saw a C-47.
Well, I was rather thrilled in one respect, although I had trained in advanced training in a plane called the AT-9 Curtiss, which was the checkout plane for the P-38 or the A-20. So I said, oh, I'm going to get into light attack bombers and fighters. Yeah. 13 of us in our class got orders to go to the United Airlines School at Bergstrom Field, C-47, C-53s. So the C-53 was a C-47 that had a staff rigging up and a door in it that was just an oval door with steps compared to the massive double doors on the C-47 that you could open up, put the ramp down and drive a Jeep in.
Wow. And how old were you exactly when all this was happening, just so we get an idea?
I was 21 years old, and I went to the south of France invasion, and I had my 22nd birthday in Rome in July. And that was quite a celebration with a fellow Pathfinder friend of mine, Howard Vos, and a parachute officer, J.J. Smith of the 82nd Airborne, who was an usher at my wedding.
So what about after D-Day? You mentioned doing drops in Operation Dragoon in August of '44. Do we have any stories around that?
Yes, but one thing I should tell you about, General Eisenhower asked the Pathfinders to set up a service for his headquarters to fly intelligence liaison and logistical liaison officers to the beachhead every day, D+4 on. And we'd leave North Holt in England, a Polish fighter squadron base. We had fighter escort, 8 o'clock in the morning to the beachhead, leave the beachhead back to North Holt at 8 o'clock at night. Double British summertime, you could read a newspaper at 10 o'clock at night. So it was an all daylight operation. But we.
This is Eisenhower's airline. Is this what you're referring to? Just to clarify for our audience.
Basically, when I was a second lieutenant, reported to the 436 troop carrier, I flew as a co-pilot for a TWA captain who taught me all kinds of tricks. And I have to credit him with a tremendous amount of what I learned. Yep.
What were some of the tricks he taught you?
Well, how to slip a C-47 if you were overshooting, and little things about how to handle a stall, and things that save your lives. And when you're flying a C-47 with all those people in it, you're saving their lives too.
Yeah.
Good feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, could you tell us a little bit about your supply when the Bastogne defenders were surrounded? Because obviously that was a very critical moment in time, and maybe give us a little background of what your understanding of what was happening on the ground at that moment, and the importance of it, and that kind of thing.
Well, the Battle of the Bulge started on the 16th of December and became pretty obvious of what was going on around the 19th. and the 82nd and the 101st Airborne were put in at different edges of the bulge. But we were iced in England. There was an ice fog, an ice. They had to take cinders out of our fireplaces and stuff to put on the runway so we could take off. And we went to Membry, where the 436, my old group, was based, but across the field was a massive Air Materiel Command barracks and headquarters and warehouses. We loaded up the airplanes, and Major Jacobson, who was in command at that time, because our colonel had dropped a stick of paratroopers on the brickyard at Bastogne to set up Rebecca Eureka. He said, Dave, take the first airplanes you can, get together, we'll catch up to you. So I took off with only 27 airplanes. We set up a formation and went directly to the eye point. And a second lieutenant in Air Force intelligence had set us down a road with the German Panzer Division on it, which became very unhealthy. And I just told the guys, I broke radio silence and told the guys we were going to slide off to the right. And we hit the deck and went off on the fields. They still peppered us a bit, but we finally pulled up to about 700 feet. And I think we dropped most of our stuff, which was only medical supplies, food, and ammo. And we dropped it just around the brickyard there at an altitude of 300 feet, which was all it needed to open the parachutes. We did not drop any paratroopers. After us, after the Pathfinders got through dropping, they came in with the gliders and other troop carrier suppliers. But they had 5th Field Hospital had been captured by the Germans. So one glider had gone in ahead of us, about a day ahead of us, and took in 3 doctors. And one of those doctors was a very close friend of my family's, and Beamy Suter. And he got awarded a Silver Star. Beamy set up the hospital there in Bastogne, and he was operating next to a German officer who had been captured, who was a medical officer. But it was amazing. That whole operation was mixed with all kinds of different stuff.
Yeah. I also understood you flew some gas for Patton as well.
Yes, we were flying gas in the jerry cans over to Patton when all of a sudden 4 B-24s had been war wearies, taking the guns out and all the armor plate. They were filled with great big black bladders. And we flew those over to Patton Tank Farm. And then one of them, unfortunately, had a collision in the air with a fighter. And I lost Pete Miner, who'd been my flight commander in Normandy. And they decided that it really wasn't worthwhile. So we went back. But we would fly gas to Patton. And I met General Patton as a young boy in Hawaii. I hot walked his horses at polo, and I learned to swear at the same time, which pleased, of course, my family tremendously. And then later, my mother was a friend of his wife's, Beatrice Hare, she was. And when Patton came to England after the slapping incident and all that, he was sort of very quietly, his Third Army headquarters up in Knutsford, and she went up and had dinner with him. She told him that I was flying Pathfinders. So when I would deliver gas to General Patton's office, his aide would say, the general would like to see you. And on a more than one occasion, I had the chance to have a breakfast or a lunch with him at his mess. And he was a real gentleman and a fighting guy. And we had great respect for him.
Did he have any interesting anecdotes happened over lunch? I know Patton was never one that was at a loss for words. So I didn't know if you've got any Patton colloquialisms that may have come up during those conversations.
Oh, I'm sworn to secrecy on that. Because when I was at school, his son came in to the same school at the class behind me. And I think because of General Patton's comments, he had me made his son's advisor to see that his son got to the right classes and didn't wore his new boy cap until we beat Lawrenceville and that kind of thing. But no, the whole family were a marvelous family, and I later kept up with his son after the general died, and it was a great loss to all of us personally when he died.
Wow. Wow. So what about, we have a little bit of time left here. I'd like to let our audience hear about, I know you had a lot of experiences after the war. Your career certainly didn't stop there. I understood that you kept flying C-47s for Transair for a bit, and then you went back into Korea and were flying the RB-26s. Is that correct?
Correct. The Douglas Invader, right? Yeah, a wonderful airplane. And it was fast and it had loads of guns. And after C-47s, it was quite a life. Tricycle gear, speed, guns, small crew. Yeah, I only had bombardier, navigator, and a gunner. That was my crew. And I did 50 missions in Korea, was over and back in 7 months. Very nice.
How'd you like flying the 26 compared to the C-47?
Oh, I like the 26, but the C-47 was more forgiving. And yeah, the C-47 was an unbelievable great airplane. You could make one in gold and put it on a mountain somewhere. Yeah.
Wow. What did you like the most about it? What really, in terms of its flying characteristics, what stands out to you the most, and why it deserves that place on top of the mountain?
Well, I think it's stability and the fact that it made air transportation physically and financially possible for the American commercial airlines to operate at a profit, which the Boeing 314 didn't, and some other airplanes. That it just revolutionized air transportation in this country. And the fact that it was re-stressed in the wings and the undercarriage and made into a troop transport and dropped paratroopers and cool gliders and did all this was absolutely remarkable. Great design, great stability, and a very forgiving airplane. It was a joy to fly on instruments or in clear daylight, comfortable airplane. And you had to stay with it. You stay ahead of it. You couldn't get lazy. You couldn't get lazy, in my respect, in any airplane. It's not a place to be lazy. If you want to do that, go to your office and put your feet up on the desk.
Well, speaking of that, so I also understand that after the war, you transitioned from the larger transport aircraft and went to jets, and were flying F-80s, F-86s. What was that like to make that transition from a large transport to a fighter aircraft, and especially a jet fighter aircraft?
Well, the first 2 weeks were a little bit shocking. My instructor laughed. He said, "Hamilton keeps looking for that fan out front." And it took a little change. And eventually I get used to not having to put the torque in on takeoff. And I eventually ended up flying for the 329th Fighter Squadron out of Stewart Air Force Base in Newburgh, New York. And when we transferred from F-86Ds to the 104s, the general came to me and he said, "Hamilton," he said, "I've got a chair for you and it just fits you with elbow pads and the whole works." So I became a staff officer at the end. And that was quite a letdown, but I still kept flying because I had to require my 60-2 to keep my flying pay.
Well, I understand you ended up at DIA, didn't you? And had some experiences with photo analysis for the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, yes. My company that I was with as a civilian, I was a weekend warrior doing my 2 weeks a year and every 1 weekend a month. And I transferred to Wilmington, Delaware, and I went to Dover, and the only opening was in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I got into photo reconnaissance and analysts and analytic programming that. And they moved me during the Cuban Missile Crisis to a field in Homestead, Florida. And we were in a building, and I did nothing but review the U-2 photographs. And we lost the U-2 down there, as a matter of fact, in Cuba. But I learned a lot about looking at photographs that were taken by airplanes and those cameras in the U-2s. It's really tell you a lot.
So Wrapping things up here, the one thing that jumps out at me is you certainly carried a lot of important cargo and had a lot of lives in your hands. So what, I guess, what are your thoughts on that when you had so many paratroopers that depended on you, and then even when you were just doing a supply drop, but the supplies were so critical? What did those missions mean for you personally?
Well, they meant a lot because you were doing your bit to keep the troops going. And even though we were based in England, I left the troop area to come home after I'd done my 100 missions and I failed my physical exam. They moved to France the day after I left. And I thought, well, when I'm through in my home, I'll go back to them. Well, the world changed and I didn't go back.
So
But
I've got
Great.
I've got one interesting from our audience. This isn't a question, but it's a comment, and they wanted you to know that you did in that uniform you're wearing today as you did in 1944. So I guess my my follow-on question to that is, what do you credit your longevity to?
Oh, I think the very good genes and the bad aim of a lot of anti-aircraft guns.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Dave, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to do this. And again, thank you for your service. I would like to wrap up a little bit and just let our audience know some of the next events that are coming up. We're going to be with the Commemorative Air Force at World War II Heritage Days. That's just going to be in just about 2 weeks from now, from April 27th to 28th in Peachtree City, Georgia. After that, we're going to be with AOPA up in Frederick, Maryland from May 10th to 11th. And then we've got the big event. That'll be the kickoff in Oxford, Connecticut. That's starting on May 13th, running through the 19th. For members of the media that are attending this webinar right now, we're going to be doing a press conference for you on the 16th. And then the big Hudson River flyover is going to be on the 18th, where we're going to bring all the aircraft up, fly over Manhattan, go around the Statue of Liberty and come back. And then, of course, the big day is May 19th, when all of the entire squadron will be departing for Europe. So Dave, Eric, Andy, Joe, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here. I thank you, the members of our audience that were able to participate. Thank you for your questions, and I hope you all have a good week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was easy.